Nathaniel Cross built his empire on one iron rule. Nothing existed on his land without his permission. But on a frozen February morning in 1881, smoke curled from a cabin he'd written off as rubble 3 years prior. Someone was living there, thriving there, on his property, without asking, without explaining. The trespasser wasn't a drifter or a fool. She was a woman who'd calculated every risk and chosen survival over safety. What Nathaniel discovered in that valley would shatter his certainty about control, justice, and the difference between ownership and belonging. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you love stories of strength, second chances, and justice, stay until the end, hit that like button, and let's begin. The wind came hard across the Montana high country that morning, carrying the bite of winter and the weight of something Nathaniel Cross couldn't name. He'd been riding since before dawn, checking fence lines along the northern boundary of his ranch, 20,000 acres of grazing land, timber stands, and water rights that stretched from the Yellowstone River to the shadow of the Absaroka Range. Everything visible belonged to him. Everything had a purpose, a place in the ledger, a value he could calculate. Nathaniel was a man built for this landscape. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from rope and leather, he carried himself with the efficiency of someone who'd learned early that sentiment was a luxury and hesitation was a liability. At 34, he'd turned a failing homestead into one of the most profitable cattle operations in the territory. He employed 16 men year-round, shipped beef to Chicago and Denver, and kept books that would make a banker weep with envy. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in systems. But systems required information, and the column of smoke rising from Hackberry Valley was information he didn't have. Nathaniel reined in his bay gelding on the ridge above the valley, his breath misting in the cold air. The smoke was thin, controlled, not a wildfire, not an accident. It came from the chimney of the old Hackberry cabin, a structure he'd last seen 3 winters ago when the roof had been half collapsed and the windows shattered. He'd written it off in his records as a total loss, useful only for salvage lumber if he ever needed it. Someone had decided otherwise. The valley was a difficult piece of land, accessible only by a narrow deer trail that wound through dense pine and over a rocky creek bed that flooded every spring. Nathaniel had never bothered to fence it because cattle wouldn't graze there and the timber wasn't worth the trouble of hauling out. It was territory he owned but didn't use, a blind spot in his otherwise meticulous management. And now someone was exploiting that blind spot. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Squatters were a persistent problem in the territories, people who assumed that unused land was unclaimed land, who built their desperation into structures and called it homesteading. He'd evicted 7 families in the past 4 years, always with the same script. This is private property. You have 3 days to vacate. Here's the name of the land office if you want to file a legal claim elsewhere. None of them ever did. He urged his horse down the ridge, following the trail he knew by memory despite rarely using it. The pines grew close here, their branches heavy with snow, and the morning light filtered through in pale shafts that made the shadows deeper. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold stone. Somewhere distant, a raven called. As he descended, details emerged. The cabin's roof had been patched, not professionally, but competently, with overlapping shakes that would shed water. The shutters had been rehung. The door, which he remembered hanging crooked on broken hinges, now sat square in its frame. A cord of split firewood was stacked against the north wall, protected from the weather by a crude lean-to made of salvaged planks. This wasn't the work of drifters. This was someone who intended to stay. Nathaniel dismounted 20 yards from the cabin, looping his reins over a low branch. He approached on foot, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The chimney smoke carried the scent of pine and something else, coffee, maybe, or soup. Through the one intact window, he caught movement, a shadow passing behind the wavy glass. He knocked once, hard, the sound flat in the cold air. The door opened immediately. The woman who stood there was perhaps 30, dressed in a wool skirt and canvas work shirt that had seen better years but were clean and mended. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her face, while thin, wasn't gaunt. She looked at him with eyes that were calm, measuring, and completely unsurprised. "Mr. Cross," she said. Not a question. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something in his assessment shifted. She knew who he was. She'd been expecting this. "You're on my land," he said. "I am," she agreed. No apology, no justification, just acknowledgement. "You know that's trespassing." "I do." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for her. She simply waited, one hand resting on the doorframe, her posture neither defensive nor confrontational. She wasn't blocking his entry, but she wasn't inviting it either. Nathaniel had conducted this conversation dozens of times. Usually by now, there were tears, excuses, a litany of hardships meant to soften his resolve. This woman offered none of that. She simply stood in the truth of her situation and waited for him to state his terms. It bothered him that he found that interesting. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 6 weeks. "And you didn't think to ask permission?" "I didn't think you'd give it." "You were right." She nodded slightly, as if confirming a calculation. "Then I chose poorly. I apologize for the imposition." Her syntax was educated, her tone measured. This wasn't a desperate widow from a played-out mining camp or a farmer's daughter escaping a bad marriage. This was someone who'd made a deliberate choice based on incomplete options. "What's your name?" Nathaniel asked. "Eliza Moore." "Where are you from, Miss Moore?" "Mrs.?" she corrected quietly. "I'm widowed. I came from Bozeman." "Bozeman's 60 miles east. That's a long way to travel for an abandoned cabin." "So it's a longer way when you don't have anywhere else to go." The statement landed without drama, without plea. It was simply fact, delivered the way someone might mention the weather or the time of day. Nathaniel glanced past her into the cabin's interior. It was small, one room, maybe 12 by 14 feet, but it was remarkably organized. A narrow bed in the corner, made with military precision. A table fashioned from crates, a chair that looked hand-repaired. Shelves built into the wall holding a sparse but orderly collection of supplies. Flour, beans, salt, a few tin plates. A pot hung over the fire, steam rising gently. Everything was clean. Everything had purpose. "You've done work here," he said. "The structure was sound. It needed repair, not replacement." "Where'd you get the materials?" "Salvage from the collapsed section of the roof. Some from deadfall timber. I bought the nails and the glass in town." "With what money?" "I had some." Her tone didn't invite further questions on that point. Nathaniel studied her. She met his gaze directly, not with defiance, but with the kind of steadiness he associated with men who'd survived war, or winter, or both. Her hands, he noticed, showed calluses and recent cuts, the evidence of hard labor, not genteel poverty. "You understand I can't let you stay here," he said. "Not without terms." "I understand." "Then why'd you do it?" For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not weakness, but a brief acknowledgement of complexity. "Because I needed shelter, and I had skills that would be wasted begging for charity I'd never receive. I gambled that if I proved my competence, you might consider an arrangement instead of an eviction." Nathaniel felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile. She'd assessed him, calculated his psychology, and made a strategic decision. It was exactly what he would have done. "That's a bold gamble," he said. "I've lost worse." "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" Eliza straightened slightly, and Nathaniel recognized the posture of someone about to negotiate from a position of no leverage who was determined to act like they had some anyway. "Winter labor in exchange for shelter," she said. "I can mend tack, process game, keep records, manage inventory. I have experience with livestock health, basic carpentry, and kitchen work sufficient for a bunkhouse. I don't require wages, just the cabin and access to basic supplies." "Until when?" "Spring. By April, I'll have saved enough from town work to move on." "Town work doing what?" "Laundry, sewing, whatever's available." Nathaniel considered this. His bunkhouse cook had quit 2 weeks ago after breaking his leg, and his foreman had been complaining about the state of the equipment shed since November. He ran a lean operation by choice, but there was always work that got deferred because the immediate demands of the cattle took priority. But this wasn't about practicality. This was about precedent. "I don't make exceptions," he said. I can't have people thinking they can settle on my land without permission. I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking for employment. The distinction was subtle but significant. Nathaniel pulled his gloves off, tucking them into his belt. Come outside. I want to see what you've actually done here. Eliza reached for a coat hanging beside the door. A man's coat, too large for her, but warm. She stepped out into the cold, and Nathaniel walked the perimeter of the cabin, examining her repairs with a critical eye. The roof work was amateur but effective. She'd overlapped the shakes correctly, sealed the gaps with pine pitch, and secured everything with hand-forged nails that looked salvaged but functional. The shutters were rehung with leather hinges, crude but weather-resistant. The woodpile was split properly, stacked to allow air circulation. Around the back, he found a small root cellar she'd dug into the hillside, lined with stones and covered with a salvaged door weighted with rocks. Inside were potatoes, turnips, and several clay jars that likely held preserves. You did all this in 6 weeks? He asked. The cellar took 10 days. The roof took 4. The rest was maintenance and provisioning. Provisioning from where? I hunted. Trapped rabbits, shot a deer. The preserves came from wild service berries I gathered before the first snow. Nathaniel turned to face her. You're telling me you built a root cellar, repaired a collapsed roof, hunted your own meat, and put up preserves, all while keeping a fire going and not getting yourself killed by weather or wildlife? Yes. In winter. In country you don't know. I read. I paid attention. I made mistakes, but I corrected them quickly. There was no pride in her voice, just accounting. She was reporting on a project completed, nothing more. Nathaniel looked at the cabin, the woodpile, the woman standing in the snow with her calm, measuring eyes, and made a decision that violated every principle of consistency he'd built his reputation on. 3 months, he said. You work for me through March, bunkhouse meals, equipment repair, whatever I need. You keep this cabin in exchange, and I'll provide basic supplies, flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil. No wages. In April, we reassess. You want to leave, you leave. You want to stay, we draft a proper contract. You steal from me, you're gone. You lie to me, you're gone. You cause problems with my men, you're gone. Are those terms clear? Eliza's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders settle slightly, tension releasing. Perfectly clear. I'll need it in writing, he said. Come to the main house tomorrow morning. We'll formalize the agreement. What time? 7. Don't be late. I won't be. Nathaniel nodded once and turned to walk back to his horse. He'd gone 5 steps when her voice stopped him. Mr. Cross? He looked back. Thank you, she said simply. He didn't acknowledge it, just continued to his horse, mounted, and rode back up the ridge without looking back. But as he climbed toward the main trail, he found himself unsettled in a way he couldn't categorize. She hadn't begged. She hadn't manipulated. She'd simply presented a transaction and waited for his decision. And something about that, the clarity of it, the absence of performance, had changed the equation in his mind. By the time he reached the ranch headquarters an hour later, Nathaniel had already begun calculating how to explain this decision to his foreman without it sounding like sentiment. Because it wasn't sentiment. It was resource allocation. A competent worker in exchange for minimal investment. Simple economics. He almost believed it. One. The main house was a 2-story structure of timber and stone that Nathaniel had built himself during the first 3 years of the ranch's operation. It was functional rather than elegant, with wide porches designed for practical weather protection and windows positioned for cross-ventilation in summer and heat retention in winter. The ground floor held a large kitchen, a dining room that doubled as an office, and a sitting room he rarely used. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, 3 of which stayed empty except when he had visiting business associates. Nathaniel lived alone by choice. He'd had a housekeeper for 2 years early on, but she'd spent more time trying to marry him off to her niece than keeping the house, so he'd let her go. Now he cooked his own meals, maintained his own space, and appreciated the silence. He was frying eggs and potatoes when his foreman, Jack Brennan, came through the kitchen door without knocking. Jack was 10 years older than Nathaniel, weathered and laconic, a man who'd worked cattle from Texas to Montana and had forgotten more about ranching than most men would ever learn. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat at the table without preamble. Saw you heading down toward Hackberry, Jack said. Smoke's been visible for a week. I know. You evict them. Hired her. Jack's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Come again? Nathaniel plated his breakfast and sat across from his foreman. Woman named Eliza Moore, widow from Bozeman. She's been squatting in the old cabin, did about 2 months' worth of competent repair work. I offered her 3 months' employment in exchange for shelter. Employment doing what? Whatever needs doing, equipment repair, bunkhouse work, inventory. Jack set his cup down carefully. Nate, you evicted a family of 5 last year for doing the exact same thing. That family tore down my fence for firewood and let their goat eat a month's worth of leather stores. This woman rebuilt a roof and put up preserves. Not the same thing. Still sets a precedent. No, it sets a standard. You want to stay on my land, you add value. She did. They didn't. Jack studied him with the expression of a man who'd known him long enough to recognize rationalization. This about competence or about something else? It's about not wasting a resource. Huh. Jack sipped his coffee. She pretty? She's competent. That's not an answer. Nathaniel met his foreman's eyes. She's organized, self-sufficient, and smart enough to negotiate from nothing. I don't care what she looks like. I care that she can do work that needs doing and won't require me to manage her. And you trust her? I trust her to act in her own self-interest, which currently aligns with following the terms I set. That's better than trust. That's clarity. Jack grunted, unconvinced but unwilling to argue further. You want me to set her up with tools and a work list? I want you to observe her for the first week. Give her tasks. See how she handles them. If she's as capable as she appears, integrate her into the rotation. If she's not, we'll reassess. And if the men give her trouble, then they'll answer to me. Nathaniel's tone left no room for interpretation. Make that clear. Jack nodded slowly. You're the boss. I am. After Jack left, Nathaniel sat alone in the kitchen, staring at his half-eaten breakfast. He'd made hundreds of hiring decisions over the years, and none of them had required this much internal justification. The fact that he was having this conversation with himself bothered him more than he wanted to admit. She'd gotten under his skin somehow, not through charm or appeal, but through sheer competence in the face of impossible odds. She'd looked at her situation, calculated her options, and executed a plan with precision. It was exactly how he operated, and recognizing his own methodology and someone else's desperate gambit had created a kind of professional respect he hadn't anticipated. Tomorrow she'd come to the house. He'd draft the agreement, set the terms, establish the boundaries. It would be a business transaction, nothing more. He believed that. He had to. Eliza arrived at 6:45 the next morning, 15 minutes early, which told Nathaniel everything he needed to know about her approach to employment. She'd clearly walked the 4 miles from the cabin, but she showed no signs of exertion, her breathing steady, her expression composed. She wore the same clothes as yesterday, but she'd added a wool scarf and her hair was pinned in a more formal arrangement. She carried nothing, no bag, no possessions, just herself and her punctuality. Come in, Nathaniel said, stepping aside. Eliza entered the house with the careful observation of someone cataloging details for later use. Her eyes moved across the kitchen's layout, the quality of the furnishings, the books stacked on the corner desk. She wasn't snooping, she was gathering information, understanding the context of the man she was about to work for. Nathaniel gestured to the table. Sit. Coffee? Thank you. He poured 2 cups and set out the document he'd drafted that morning. 2 pages of clear terms, expectations, and termination conditions. He'd worked on it for an hour, revising until every clause was precise and defensible. Eliza accepted the coffee and read the document in silence, her eyes moving methodically down each page. Nathaniel watched her read, noting how her expression didn't change, how she didn't skim or skip ahead. She absorbed every word with the same careful attention. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at him. You've included a clause that allows immediate termination without cause. I have. That's heavily weighted in your favor. It is. Do you object? No. It's honest. She picked up the pen he'd set beside the document. Where do I sign? You don't want to negotiate any of it? The terms are clear and fair given the imbalance of power. You're offering shelter and supplies in exchange for labor. I have no leverage to demand better conditions, and you've been more generous than you needed to be. Negotiating would be theater. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, genuinely surprised. Most people would at least try. Most people haven't learned that honesty saves more energy than performance. She signed her name at the bottom of both pages in clear, educated script. When do I start? Today. Jack Brennan is my foreman. Tall man, gray beard, permanent scowl. He'll be waiting at the equipment shed in an hour. He'll assign your work and evaluate your competence. Report to him, follow his instructions, and don't make me regret this decision. I won't. Eliza stood, leaving the coffee half-finished. She nodded once, a gesture of professional acknowledgement rather than gratitude, and walked to the door. With her hand on the latch, she paused. Mr. Cross, may I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you say yes? Nathaniel considered the question. He could have given her the practical answer, the one about resource allocation and work efficiency. But she'd been honest with him, brutally so, and something about that demanded equal honesty in return. Because you didn't ask me to save you, he said. You asked me to employ you. That's the difference between charity and contract. I don't do charity. Eliza's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Neither do I. She left without another word, and Nathaniel sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the signed document and wondering what exactly he'd just set in motion. Outside, the February wind howled across the valley, carrying snow and the promise of a long winter still ahead. But inside the house, something had shifted, something small and undefined, like the first crack in ice before the thaw. Nathaniel told himself it meant nothing. He was good at lying to himself. He'd had a lot of practice. Jack Brennan stood in the equipment shed, surrounded by 3 months' worth of deferred maintenance, and tried to decide if his boss had lost his mind or found a strange kind of genius. The woman, Eliza Moore, according to Nate, arrived exactly on time, which was the first point in her favor. The second was that she looked at the shed's chaos without flinching. Mrs. Moore, Jack said. Mr. Brennan. Boss says you're here to work. I am. Jack gestured at the workbench piled with broken harnesses, cracked axe handles, and rusted tools. You know anything about leather work? Some. I can do basic stitching and repair. Nothing ornamental. Don't need ornamental. Need functional. He tossed her a bridle with a broken cheek strap. Fix that. Eliza caught it, examined the break, and moved to the workbench without asking for tools or instructions. She found the leather punch, the waxed thread, and the needle on her own, studying the existing stitching before carefully removing the damaged section. Jack watched without appearing to watch, the way he'd evaluated 100 ranch hands over the years. She worked methodically, testing the tension of each stitch, keeping her lines straight. When she finished 10 minutes later, she handed him the bridle. He examined her work critically. The stitching was tight, even, and properly reinforced at the stress points. It wouldn't win any prizes, but it would hold. Adequate, he said, which was the highest praise he gave anyone on first attempt. Thank you. Don't thank me. Do it 30 more times. He pointed at a barrel filled with broken tack. Everything in there needs repair or replacement evaluation. Sort them into piles, fixable, questionable, and trash. Fix what you can, set aside what you can't, and be ready to explain your reasoning. Timeline? End of day. Liza looked at this barrel, easily 3 weeks of work by any reasonable standard, and nodded. I'll do what I can. She didn't complain, didn't negotiate, just pulled the first piece from the barrel and got to work. Jack left her there and went about his other duties, checking in periodically throughout the day. Each time he passed the shed, she was working steadily, her movements efficient, her focus absolute. She didn't chat with the ranch hands who wandered by, didn't take unnecessary breaks, didn't perform her competence for an audience. By 4 o'clock, she'd created 3 organized piles and completed repairs on 18 pieces of tack. Jack examined her work, testing every stitch, every knot, every splice. All functional, some crude, but all sound. You get through half of it, he said. Yes, sir? The half you didn't finish, did you sort it? I did. 12 pieces are fixable with proper tools and leather stock. 6 need professional replacement. 4 are total losses. Jack checked her assessment against his own mental inventory. She'd called it correctly on every piece. You work this pace every day, you'll finish by Friday, he said. I will. Good. Be here at 7 tomorrow. Don't expect different work just because this is done. There's always more. I understand. As Eliza walked back toward the cabin in the fading light, Jack stood in the equipment shed and tried to figure out what bothered him about the situation. She was competent, efficient, and low maintenance, exactly what the ranch needed. But there was something in her careful precision, her absolute control of emotion, that suggested survival strategy rather than personality. He'd seen it before in men who'd come back from war or disaster. That kind of rigid self-discipline that was the only thing standing between function and collapse. Whatever had brought Eliza Moore to a collapsing cabin in the middle of winter, it wasn't bad luck or poor planning. It was escape. And Jack wondered what exactly she was running from. Nathaniel didn't see Eliza for the rest of the week. He was occupied with a contract dispute in town, a boundary survey to the north, and the endless paperwork that came with operating a ranch the size of his. Jack's daily reports confirmed she was performing adequately, which meant Nathaniel didn't need to supervise directly. That should have been the end of it. An employee hired, work assigned, results delivered. Simple transaction. But on Friday evening, when Nathaniel rode past the equipment shed and saw the organized workspace, the repaired tack hanging in neat rows, and the detailed inventory list written in Eliza's precise hand, he felt something uncomfortably close to satisfaction. Not because the work was done, he'd expected that, but because it was done right. That night, he drafted a supply list for the bunkhouse cook and added coffee, lamp oil, and a bolt of canvas to the delivery for the hackberry cabin. Not charity. Contract fulfillment. She'd earned it. He kept telling himself that, and kept failing to believe it completely. The first month passed with the steady rhythm of winter work, each day measured in tasks completed and systems maintained. Eliza moved through her assignments with the same careful precision that had marked her first week, and Nathaniel found himself checking Jack's reports with an attention to detail that went beyond standard supervision. The numbers were always the same: work completed on time, no complaints from the men, no requests for special consideration. She was, in every measurable way, exactly what he'd calculated she would be. Which made it all the more unsettling when he began to notice the things that couldn't be measured. The way she organized the tool shed wasn't just functional. It was intelligent, grouping equipment by seasonal use and frequency of access in a way that saved his men 15 minutes every morning. The inventory system she'd created for the bunkhouse supplies flagged upcoming shortages 3 weeks in advance instead of the usual panicked last-minute orders. When one of the younger ranch hands cut his hand badly on a broken hinge, she'd cleaned and dressed the wound with the efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine before, asking no questions and offering no explanations. She never asked for anything, never complained, never drew attention to herself beyond the work itself. It was professional. It was exactly what their contract stipulated, and it bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. By early March, Nathaniel had stopped pretending he wasn't paying attention. He found himself riding past the equipment shed more often than necessary, observing without interfering. Eliza worked in all weather, through snowstorms that sent his men to shelter, through wind that made the shed walls creak and groan. She kept a fire going in the small stove, not for comfort, but for the leather work that required heat for proper shaping. One afternoon, he watched from a distance as she taught 2 of his younger hands the correct way to splice rope, demonstrating the technique with patience he hadn't known she possessed. They listened intently, trying and failing and trying again while she corrected their hand positions without criticism. She's got a teaching manner, Jack observed, appearing beside Nathaniel's horse without warning. Nathaniel didn't pretend he hadn't been watching. She does. Boys respect her, that's rare. They respect competence. No, Jack said thoughtfully. They respect her because she doesn't perform it. She just does the work and expects them to do the same. No dramatics, no need to prove anything. It's refreshing. Nathaniel glanced at his foreman. You approve, then? I approve of anyone who makes my job easier. Whether I trust her story is a different question. You think she's lying? I think she's omitting. There's a difference. Jack pulled his collar up against the wind. Woman that educated, that capable, that self-sufficient doesn't end up in an abandoned cabin by accident. She ran from something, and eventually we're going to find out what. The observation settled in Nathaniel's chest like cold water. He'd been so focused on what Eliza could do that he'd stopped questioning why she was doing it. The contract was clear, employment through March, reassessment in April. But April was 3 weeks away, and he realized he had no idea what she planned to do when the term ended. More troubling, he realized he wanted to know. That evening, Nathaniel did something he hadn't done in the 6 weeks since hiring Eliza. He rode down to the Hackberry cabin unannounced. The valley looked different in early March than it had in February. The snow had begun its slow retreat, revealing patches of brown grass and exposed stone. The creek ran fuller now, fed by melt from higher elevations, and the pines seemed less oppressive without their heavy burdens of ice. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney in a thin, steady column. As Nathaniel approached, he could see changes he hadn't noticed before. The lean-to that had protected the woodpile now extended along the entire north wall, creating a covered workspace. The shutters had been painted with something, pine pitch maybe, or rendered fat, to weatherproof them. A small garden plot had been cleared and turned, ready for spring planting if anyone planned to be here long enough to see a harvest. Eliza was outside, splitting kindling with an economy of motion that spoke of practice. She wore the same canvas workshirt and wool skirt, but she'd added a leather apron that looked handmade. Her sleeves were rolled despite the cold, and her hands moved with rhythmic precision. She looked up as he dismounted, showing no surprise at his arrival. "Mr. Cross," she said, setting the axe aside. "Mrs. Moore." Nathaniel tied his horse to the crude hitching post she'd installed. "I wanted to check on the cabin's condition before the spring thaw." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. "The roof is holding," Eliza said. "The pitch I applied should last another season at minimum. The shutters will need replacing eventually, but they'll survive this winter." "This winter," Nathaniel repeated. "What about next winter?" Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, her expression carefully neutral. "Our contract ends in 3 weeks. I assumed you'd want the cabin available for other uses." "What other uses?" "Storage, seasonal housing for temporary workers, whatever you need." Nathaniel looked at the garden plot, the extended lean-to, the obvious care she'd invested in a structure she apparently planned to abandon. "You've done a lot of work for someone who's leaving." "I don't do things halfway, Mr. Cross. Even temporary things deserve to be done right." "That's impractical." "Perhaps. But it's how I'm built." The admission was more personal than anything she'd shared before, and it created an opening Nathaniel found himself wanting to explore. "Where will you go in April?" "Back to Bozeman, most likely. There's laundry work available, and I have a contact who might offer room and board in exchange for housekeeping." "Laundry work?" Nathaniel said flatly. "After everything you've accomplished here." Eliza's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Laundry work is honest employment." "I didn't say it wasn't. I said it's a waste of your capabilities." "My capabilities are irrelevant if no one's willing to pay for them in any other capacity." The bitterness in her voice was faint but unmistakable, and Nathaniel recognized it for what it was. Not self-pity, but exhausted realism. She'd tried before. Whatever had brought her to this valley, it had taught her that competence wasn't always enough. "What happened in Bozeman?" he asked. Eliza's hand stilled on the apron. For a long moment she didn't answer, and Nathaniel thought she might refuse entirely. But then she moved to the woodpile, sat on one of the larger logs, and looked at him with the same direct honesty she'd shown that first morning. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said. "Pneumonia. We had a small property outside town, 40 acres, a cabin, enough to sustain us. When he died, I tried to manage it alone, but the land was in his name only. His family contested the inheritance, claimed I had no legal right to remain." "Did you?" "Legally, no. We'd married quickly, and he never updated the deed. Morally, I'd worked that land for 3 years, but morality doesn't hold up in court." She picked up a piece of kindling, turning it in her hands. "I hired a lawyer with what little savings we had. He took my money and filed the paperwork too late. By the time I realized his incompetence, The judge had ruled against me. Nathaniel's expression hardened. The lawyer stole from you. The lawyer was negligent, which legally is different from theft. I couldn't prove intentional fraud, so I had no recourse. Eliza's voice remained steady, clinical even. I had 2 weeks to vacate. I sold what I could, packed what I couldn't, and left with $83 and a trunk of possessions. And came here. Not immediately. I tried to find work in Bozeman, but word had spread about the court case. People assumed I'd been trying to steal land that wasn't mine, that I was a grasping widow looking for easy money. No one would hire me for anything beyond day labor. She said it without emotion, but Nathaniel heard the weight beneath the words. The systematic destruction of reputation, the casual cruelty of assumption. She'd been competent, honest, hardworking, and it hadn't mattered because the story people chose to believe was simpler than the truth. So you came to my valley, Nathaniel said. I remembered hearing about an old cabin on Crossland that had been abandoned. I thought if I could make it functional, prove my worth through work instead of words, maybe I could negotiate for something more permanent. She looked at him directly. I was right. You were lucky. I was strategic. Luck would have been you evicting me without conversation. I ensured conversation was necessary. Despite himself, Nathaniel felt the corner of his mouth lift. By making yourself too valuable to discard. Exactly. The silence that followed was different from their previous exchanges, less formal, more balanced. Nathaniel sat on the chopping block, facing her across the small clearing, and felt the dynamic shift from employer and employee to something that resembled actual conversation. What was your husband's family's argument, he asked, that he'd married beneath his station and I'd manipulated him into the union. His father wanted the land for his younger son, and I was simply in the way of family legacy. Eliza's expression remained neutral. The irony is that Thomas, my husband, had no relationship with his family before we married. They only cared about the property after he died. Could you have fought harder? With what resources? I had no money, no family, no social standing. Fighting would have left me destitute and still without the land. Leaving at least let me keep my dignity and what little cash remained. It was a calculation Nathaniel understood completely, knowing when to cut losses, when resistance became self-destruction. She'd made the practical choice, the survival choice, even as it cost her everything she'd built. And the lawyer who failed you? He asked. Still practices in Bozeman, still takes cases from desperate people who don't know any better. The quiet fury in her voice was the first real emotion she'd shown, and it told Nathaniel more about her character than any reference letter could have. She wasn't angry about her own loss. She was angry about the systematic exploitation of people who had no power to defend themselves. What was his name? Nathaniel asked. Eliza looked at him sharply. Why? Because men like that rely on their victims staying silent. What was his name? She hesitated, then said quietly, Marcus Haywood. Has an office on Main Street next to the Assayers. Nathaniel filed the name away without comment, but something in his expression must have shifted because Eliza stood abruptly. I didn't tell you this to solicit revenge, Mr. Cross. I told you because you asked for the truth. I know. Then please don't complicate my life further by making this into something it isn't. I lost my land. I survived. I moved forward. That's the end of the story. Is it? Eliza's hands clenched briefly at her sides. It has to be. Nathaniel stood as well, recognizing the boundary she was drawing. He'd pushed further than their professional relationship warranted, and while she'd answered honestly, she was making it clear that honesty didn't constitute invitation. Your contract ends on April 1st, he said, shifting back to business. If you want to extend it, the terms would need to change. Change how? Wages. Proper employment, not just shelter exchange. I'd want you managing the equipment inventory full-time, possibly training some of the younger hands in basic maintenance. Eliza stared at him. You're offering me a permanent position. I'm offering you employment that matches your competence. Whether it's permanent depends on whether you want it to be. Why? Because you're wasting your time doing laundry when you could be doing work that actually matters. Because my operation runs more efficiently with you here than without you. Because it's good business. He paused. And because you deserve better than what you've gotten. The last statement hung between them, more personal than professional, and Eliza's expression softened into something that might have been gratitude or might have been grief. Nathaniel couldn't tell which. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Take your time, but know that the offer is genuine and the terms will be fair." Nathaniel mounted his horse and rode back toward the main house, leaving Eliza standing in the clearing with her kindling and her careful walls and the first real choice she'd had in 2 years. Behind him, the smoke from her chimney continued its steady rise into the darkening sky, a signal of occupation, of survival, of a life being rebuilt one careful decision at a time. 2 days later, Nathaniel rode into Bozeman with a purpose that had nothing to do with ranch business and everything to do with the quiet fury that had been building since Eliza's story. He told Jack he was checking on a contract dispute. He told himself he was gathering information. Both were lies. The law office of Marcus Haywood occupied a narrow building wedged between the assayer's office and a dry goods store. The sign outside was professionally painted, the windows clean, the door well maintained. Everything about it projected competence and trustworthiness. Nathaniel tied his horse and entered without knocking. The interior was exactly what he expected: oak furniture, law books lining the walls, a clerk's desk in the outer office, and a private door leading to the lawyer's personal space. The clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up with practiced politeness. "How may I help you, sir?" "I'm here to see Mr. Haywood. I have a property matter that requires legal expertise." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm willing to wait." The clerk glanced at the closed door. "Mr. Haywood is with a client currently. If you could return tomorrow, I'll wait." Something in Nathaniel's tone made the clerk reconsider arguing. "Of course, sir. Please have a seat." Nathaniel remained standing, examining the framed certificates on the wall, the ledgers stacked on the filing cabinet, the entire careful construction of professional legitimacy. 20 minutes later, the private door opened and a middle-aged woman emerged, clutching a handkerchief and looking devastated. Marcus Haywood followed her out, his expression sympathetic in a way that looked rehearsed. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the kind of soft hands that had never done manual labor. His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who made a living from other people's trust. "Mrs. Patterson, please don't worry. I'll file the paperwork this week and we'll have this resolved shortly." The woman nodded, paid the clerk a fee that made her wince, and left. Haywood watched her go, then turned to Nathaniel with professional curiosity. "I apologize for the wait, Mr. Cross, Nathaniel Cross." Recognition didn't flicker in Haywood's expression, which told Nathaniel that Eliza had been one case among many, not even memorable enough to register. That somehow made it worse. "Please, come in," Haywood gestured to his office. "How can I assist you today?" Nathaniel entered the office and sat in the client chair, a position he detested. Haywood settled behind his desk with the ease of a man comfortable with power imbalance. "I understand you handle property disputes," Nathaniel said. "Among other matters, yes. What's the nature of your situation?" "I'm considering purchasing land in the area, but I've heard there can be complications with deed transfers, inheritance claims, that sort of thing. I wanted to consult with someone experienced before proceeding." Haywood nodded sagely. "A wise precaution. Property law in the territories can be complex, especially when dealing with unmarried claimants or contested inheritances." "Contested inheritances," Nathaniel repeated. "I imagine you handle many of those." "More than I'd like, frankly. It's unfortunate how often families dispute the wishes of the deceased, particularly when widows are involved." Haywood's expression turned sympathetic again. "Women, bless them, often don't understand the legal nuances of property ownership. They assume marriage grants automatic rights when the law requires proper documentation. And when that documentation doesn't exist, then the legal heir, typically a blood relative, has rightful claim. It's not pleasant, but it's the law." Nathaniel kept his expression neutral. "And you help these widows understand their position?" "I do my best to guide them through the process, yes, though I'm afraid the outcomes are rarely in their favor. Even when they've worked the land, improved it, invested their own labor." Haywood spread his hands in a gesture of helpless sympathy. "The law doesn't recognize sweat equity in property disputes, Mr. Cross. Without legal claim, labor is simply labor." Unfortunate, but clear. And you charge these women for this guidance? Standard consultation fees, yes. Legal expertise isn't free, and even unsuccessful cases require time and research. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying the lawyer with the cold assessment he usually reserved for livestock evaluation. How much did you charge Eliza Moore? The name landed like a stone in still water. Haywood's expression flickered, just briefly, but enough for Nathaniel to see the recognition, the calculation, the quick mental sorting of memory. I'm afraid I can't discuss other clients' cases, Haywood said carefully. Confidentiality, you understand. Of course. Let me be more specific. How much did you charge her before filing her paperwork too late for it to matter? Haywood's face went carefully blank. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mr. Cross. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. You took her money, filed late, and cost her everything she had. That's not legal guidance. That's theft dressed up as incompetence. That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate one. Haywood stood, his professional warmth evaporating. I think this consultation is over, Mr. Cross. If you have complaints about my practice, you're welcome to file them with the territorial bar. I'm confident they'll find my conduct entirely appropriate. Nathaniel stood as well, but didn't move toward the door. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Haywood. You're going to review Mrs. Moore's case file again. You're going to identify any procedural errors you made. And if there's any legal avenue to revisit that judgment, you're going to pursue it at no charge to her. And if I refuse, then I'm going to make it my personal business to review every case you've handled in the past 5 years. I'm going to talk to every widow, every desperate farmer, every vulnerable client who trusted you. And I'm going to find a pattern of negligence that even the territorial bar can't ignore. Haywood's face flushed. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice. Fix what you broke, or have your entire practice examined in excruciating detail by someone with the resources and motivation to do it thoroughly. The silence stretched between them, taut with calculation. Haywood was weighing odds, measuring risk, trying to determine if Nathaniel was bluffing. Nathaniel let him wonder. Finally, Haywood said, Even if I wanted to help, the case is closed. The property was transferred legally to the family. There's nothing to revisit. Then you'll document that in writing with a full explanation of what actions you took and when. Mrs. Moore deserves that much honesty, even if she doesn't deserve justice. This is highly irregular. So is taking money from desperate people and failing them systematically. Choose, Mr. Haywood, help or hindrance. You have until Friday to decide. Nathaniel walked out without waiting for an answer, leaving the lawyer standing in his office with his certificates and his ledgers and his carefully maintained reputation suddenly vulnerable to scrutiny. Outside, the March air felt clean and cold. Nathaniel mounted his horse and rode back toward the ranch, knowing he'd just complicated Eliza's life in exactly the way she'd asked him not to. But he'd seen too many men like Haywood, too many systems built to exploit the vulnerable while maintaining plausible deniability. And he'd learned long ago that some things mattered more than professional distance or contractual boundaries. Justice was one of them. Whether Eliza would agree was another question entirely. He'd find out soon enough. Nathaniel didn't tell Eliza about his visit to Bozeman. He returned to the ranch late that evening and went about his business as if nothing had changed, though Jack noticed the tension in his shoulders and wisely asked no questions. The next 3 days passed in the ordinary rhythm of ranch work, cattle counts, fence inspections, supply orders, while Nathaniel waited for Haywood's response and wondered if he'd overstepped so badly that there would be no recovering the professional distance he'd worked so hard to maintain. On Friday morning, a telegram arrived at the ranch office. Nathaniel read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He sat for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, before standing and walking out to find Jack. "I need you to cover the afternoon," he said. "Something's come up in town." Jack looked up from the tally sheet he was reviewing. "Problem?" "Possibly, or possibly the opposite." "That's not an answer, Nate." "It's the only one I have right now." Nathaniel rode back to Bozeman that afternoon, the telegram folded in his jacket pocket like evidence of something he couldn't quite name. The weather had turned warmer in the past few days, the kind of false spring that Montana specialized in. Temperatures climbing into the 50s, Snow melting into mud, everything suddenly smelling of wet earth and pine sap. In 2 weeks it would probably snow again, but for now the world felt like it was exhaling after holding its breath all winter. Haywood's office looked the same as it had 3 days prior, but the lawyer himself seemed diminished somehow when Nathaniel entered. The clerk showed him in immediately this time, and Haywood stood from behind his desk with an expression that managed to be both resentful and carefully professional. "Mr. Cross," he said, "I received your telegram." "And I received yours. You said you found something." Haywood gestured to a file open on his desk. "I reviewed Mrs. Moore's case as you requested. The procedural timeline was indeed problematic, though I maintain that the final outcome would have been the same regardless of filing date." "What did you find?" "The inheritance claim filed by the deceased father was based on a will that predated the marriage. Standard practice would be to check for any updated documentation that might supersede it. I did file the appropriate requests, but—" He hesitated, and Nathaniel saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of how much truth to admit. "The responses came back after the court date. Had I filed 2 weeks earlier, we would have had time to review them properly." "And what did those responses contain?" Haywood picked up a document from the file, holding it like something fragile. "A letter of intent, filed with the county clerk 6 months before Mr. Moore's death, stating his intention to transfer the property deed to include his wife as co-owner. The paperwork was never completed, but the letter establishes clear testamentary intent." Nathaniel felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Testamentary intent would have overridden the previous will. In territorial court, possibly. It's not guaranteed, but it would have provided grounds for appeal at minimum. Which you didn't pursue because you filed too late to discover it existed. "Mr. Cross, I handled dozens of cases simultaneously. The timeline was unfortunate, but it wasn't—" "It was negligence," Nathaniel said flatly. "Call it what it is." Haywood's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled another document from the file. "I've drafted a letter to the current property holder, Mr. Moore's younger brother, explaining the situation and requesting he consider a settlement with Mrs. Moore based on the discovered documentation." "A request. I have no legal authority to demand anything. The case is closed." "Then reopen it." "That's not how the law works, Mr. Cross. The judgment stands unless Mrs. Moore files for appeal, which would require new legal fees, a new filing, and no guarantee of success." Nathaniel took the letter from Haywood's hand and read it carefully. It was professionally worded, legally sound, and completely toothless. A request with no enforcement mechanism, sent to a man who had no incentive to respond. "This is inadequate," Nathaniel said. "It's what's legally available." "No. It's what you're willing to do without risking your reputation or your time." Nathaniel set the letter down. "Here's what you're actually going to do. You're going to file a formal motion to reopen the case based on new evidence. You're going to argue that the letter of intent constitutes grounds for reconsidering the inheritance claim, and you're going to do it at no charge to Mrs. Moore, because this is your mistake to fix. I've already explained that's not— and you're going to contact every client you've represented in similar cases over the past 3 years and offer them the same review, because if Mrs. Moore's case had this kind of oversight, I'm guessing others did too." Haywood's face went pale. "That's impossible. I'd have to review hundreds of files. Then hire additional clerks. Consider it an investment in professional integrity. You can't force me to do this." "You're right. I can't." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. "But I can make sure every lawyer, judge, and clerk in this territory knows exactly how you conduct business. I can file formal complaints with the territorial bar detailing your pattern of negligence. I can personally fund legal representation for every client you've failed, and I can make it my mission to ensure you never practice law again." The silence that followed was absolute. Haywood stared at him with a mixture of fury and fear, calculating odds that were rapidly shifting against him. "This is about more than one woman's property dispute," Haywood said finally. "This is personal for you." "No, it's about principle. You exploited vulnerable people because you knew they had no recourse. That ends now." "And if I refuse?" Then you'll discover exactly how much damage one determined man with resources can do to a career built on other people's desperation. Nathaniel stood, placing both hands flat on the desk between them. You have a choice, Mr. Haywood. Be part of the solution or be the example. But understand that either way, Mrs. Moore gets justice. The only question is whether you destroy yourself in the process. He left before Haywood could respond, walking out into the March afternoon with the letter of intent folded in his pocket and a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. It wasn't complete victory. The case would still need to be reopened, argued, and won. But it was movement. It was possibility where there had been none before. As Nathaniel rode back toward the ranch, he allowed himself to imagine Eliza's reaction when he told her. Then he immediately stopped imagining, because he had no idea how she would respond to him taking action she'd specifically asked him not to take. He'd deal with that when it came. For now, he had evidence, he had leverage, and he had a lawyer who was going to have to choose between doing the right thing and losing everything. It was more than Eliza had 3 days ago. Whether she would thank him for it remained to be seen. The confrontation came sooner than Nathaniel expected. He'd planned to tell Eliza himself, to explain his reasoning and present the letter of intent as carefully as possible. Instead, he arrived back at the ranch to find her waiting on the porch of the main house, her expression tightly controlled and her posture radiating barely contained fury. Jack stood near the barn, watching the scene with the wary attention of someone who recognized an approaching storm. Mrs. Moore, Nathaniel said carefully, dismounting, you went to Bozeman. It wasn't a question. I did. You confronted Marcus Haywood about my case. I spoke with him, yes. After I explicitly asked you not to complicate my life? Her voice was level, but there was steel underneath it. After I told you that story was finished. Nathaniel tied his horse and turned to face her fully. I found new evidence. A letter of intent your husband filed that should have been included in the original case. I don't care what you found. I told you to leave it alone. And I told you that you deserve better than what you got. That hasn't changed. Eliza's hands clenched at her sides. You had no right. I had every right to investigate a lawyer's professional misconduct. This wasn't about professional misconduct. This was about you deciding my situation required rescue. The accusation landed hard and Nathaniel felt his own temper spark. I'm not trying to rescue you. I'm trying to correct an injustice. Without asking me, without consulting me, without considering that maybe I had reasons for not pursuing this further. She stepped closer, her eyes bright with anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've given you legal grounds to appeal a fraudulent judgment. You've put a target on my back. Her voice shook slightly. Marcus Haywood knows powerful people in Bozeman. If you've threatened him the way I suspect you have, he'll retaliate. Not against you. You're too well connected, too wealthy. He'll come after me. He'll make sure I can't find work anywhere in the territory. He'll destroy what little reputation I have left. Nathaniel hadn't considered that. He'd been so focused on leverage and justice that he hadn't calculated the political cost to Eliza herself. The realization felt like stepping into a hole he hadn't seen coming. He won't, Nathaniel said, though his certainty had wavered. I made it clear that any retaliation would result in his complete professional destruction. And you think that will stop him? Men like Haywood don't operate on logic, Mr. Cross. They operate on ego and spite. You've wounded his pride, and he'll take it out on the easiest target he can find. Then I'll protect you. I don't want your protection. The words came out sharp and final. I want autonomy. I want the right to make my own choices about my own life, even if those choices don't make sense to you. Even if those choices mean accepting injustice? Yes. Eliza's expression softened slightly, shifting from anger to something more complicated. Because sometimes accepting injustice is the price of survival. Sometimes fighting back costs more than the victory is worth. I learned that the hard way, and I made peace with it. So you were just going to let him get away with it? Let him keep exploiting other people the same way? That's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to myself, to my survival, to building something stable enough that the next disaster doesn't destroy me completely. She took a breath, visibly steadying herself. You're a good man, Mr. Cross. You see wrong, and you want to fix it. But you can't fix the entire world, and you especially can't fix it by making decisions for people who didn't ask for your intervention." The words stung precisely because they were accurate. Nathaniel had acted from principle, from anger at a system that protected men like Haywood while punishing women like Eliza. But he'd done it without her consent, without considering that she might have made a conscious choice to walk away rather than continue fighting a battle that had already cost her everything. "I should have asked you first," he said quietly. "Yes, you should have. I can't undo it now." "No, you can't." Eliza looked away toward the mountains rising in the distance. "What did Haywood say? When you confronted him?" Nathaniel pulled the letter of intent from his pocket and handed it to her. "He found this in your husband's files. It establishes testamentary intent to include you on the property deed. He admits he should have discovered it before the court date." Eliza unfolded the paper, her hands trembling slightly as she read her late husband's handwriting. Nathaniel watched emotions flicker across her face: grief, recognition, something that might have been vindication or might have been fresh pain. When she finished reading, she folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. "Thomas wrote this 6 months before he died," she said softly. "I didn't know. It should have been part of your case. It should have been a lot of things." She looked at Nathaniel directly. "What happens now?" "Haywood has 2 options. He can file a motion to reopen your case based on this new evidence, or he can refuse and deal with the consequences I outlined. Either way, you have grounds for appeal that didn't exist before." "And if I don't want to appeal?" The question hung between them, simple and devastating. Nathaniel had assumed she would want justice, would want her property back, would want vindication. But he'd assumed without asking, and now he stood facing the possibility that everything he'd done was unwanted. "Then you don't appeal," he said. "This is your choice, Eliza. I can't make it for you." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need." "And Mr. Cross? Our contract ends in 2 weeks. I need to know if the offer of continued employment still stands, regardless of what I decide about this." The question was a test, and they both knew it. She was asking if his support was conditional on her gratitude, on her accepting his help, on her being the kind of grateful victim who validated his actions. "The offer stands," Nathaniel said firmly. "Your employment has nothing to do with legal disputes or past injustice. It's based on your competence and my need for someone with your skills. That hasn't changed." Eliza nodded slowly. "Then I'll give you my answer about both matters by the end of the month." She left without another word, walking back toward the equipment shed with the letter still clutched in her hand. Nathaniel watched her go, feeling the weight of his miscalculation settling heavy in his chest. Jack approached slowly from the barn. "That looked pleasant." "She's angry." "She's terrified," Jack corrected. "There's a difference." "I was trying to help." "I know, but help isn't help if it's not wanted." Jack pulled his tobacco pouch from his pocket, considering it before tucking it away again. "You care about her." It wasn't a question, but Nathaniel found himself wanting to deny it anyway. "I care about justice." "Justice is abstract. She's specific. And you're smart enough to know the difference, even if you're not ready to admit it." Nathaniel turned sharply. "This is business, Jack." "No. Business would have been letting Haywood's negligence stay buried. This was personal, and the sooner you're honest about that, the sooner you can figure out what you actually want from this situation." "I want her to have what she's owed." "Why?" The question was simple and impossible to answer. Why did he care what happened to Eliza Moore? Why had he ridden to Bozeman and threatened a lawyer and risked creating exactly the kind of complications she'd feared? Why was he standing here feeling like he'd failed at something that shouldn't have mattered this much? Because she'd walked into his valley 6 weeks ago with nothing but competence and dignity, and she'd reminded him that strength came in forms he hadn't learned to recognize. Because she didn't perform her survival, she simply survived, and there was something absolutely honest about that in a world full of pretense. Because when she looked at him, she saw him clearly, not his wealth, or his land, or his reputation, but the man who made decisions and lived with their consequences. And because somewhere between the equipment shed and the hackberry cabin and the careful boundaries they'd both maintained, he'd started to care about her future in a way that had nothing to do with employment contracts or professional distance. I don't know, Nathaniel said finally. Jack made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been skepticism. Well, you better figure it out before you make things worse. He left Nathaniel standing in the yard, alone with the fading light and the knowledge that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The question now was whether Eliza would forgive the crossing, or whether he'd destroyed the fragile trust they'd built through sheer arrogant certainty that he knew better than she did about her own life. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Eliza Moore in care of Nathaniel Cross. Jack brought it to him with raised eyebrows, but no comment, and Nathaniel stared at the return address, a law office in Helena, before walking out to the equipment shed to deliver it personally. Eliza was organizing hardware when he arrived, sorting nails and screws into labeled containers with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. She looked up at his approach, her expression neutral but wary. "This came for you," Nathaniel said, holding out the envelope. She wiped her hands on her apron before taking it, examining the return address with a slight frown. "I don't know anyone in Helena." "Open it." Eliza broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of official letterhead. Nathaniel watched her eyes move across the page, saw her expression shift from confusion to shock to something that looked dangerously close to hope. "What is it?" he asked when she didn't speak. "It's from the Territorial Land Commission." Her voice sounded distant, disbelieving. "They're investigating irregularities and property transfers in Gallatin County. They want me to provide testimony about my case." Nathaniel felt something loosen in his chest. "That's the county where your land was." "I know." Eliza looked up at him. "Did you do this?" "No, I contacted Haywood, no one else." "Then how—" "Maybe Haywood isn't the only lawyer with integrity problems. Maybe your case wasn't the only one with suspicious timing." Nathaniel moved closer, careful not to crowd her. "Or maybe someone at the territorial level has been waiting for enough evidence to justify an investigation, and your case provided it." Eliza read the letter again, her hands shaking slightly. "They want me in Helena in 2 weeks. They're offering to cover travel expenses and provide legal representation if I'm willing to testify about the procedural failures in my case. Will you go?" She looked at him, and Nathaniel saw the war happening behind her eyes, the part of her that wanted to fight, wanted vindication, wanted to prove that her competence and her claims had been valid all along, battling against the part that had learned survival meant not making waves, not drawing attention, not risking the fragile stability she'd worked so hard to build. "I don't know," she said quietly. "If I testify and nothing changes, I'll have exposed myself for nothing. But if I don't testify, and this is the one chance to actually fix what was broken, then you'll always wonder," Nathaniel finished. Yes. He wanted to tell her to go, to fight, to take the risk, but he'd already made that mistake once, already imposed his judgment on her choices. So instead he simply said, "Whatever you decide, I'll support it. If you need time off to go to Helena, you have it. If you need someone to review the legal documents before you sign anything, I'll find you a lawyer you can trust. And if you decide not to go at all, that's your right, and I'll respect it." Eliza studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I was wrong before. I pushed when I should have asked. I assumed when I should have listened. I'm trying to do better." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She tucked the letter carefully into her apron pocket, then returned to her hardware sorting with hands that were steadier than they had been a moment before. "I'll think about it. Take your time." Nathaniel left her there among the nails and screws and careful organization, and as he walked back to the main house, he realized that this was what respect actually looked like. Not making grand gestures or forcing solutions, but creating space for someone to make their own choices and standing ready to support whatever they decided. It was harder than he'd expected, but it was right. That evening, Nathaniel sat at his desk with the ranch ledgers open in front of him, but his mind was entirely elsewhere. He kept thinking about the letter from Helena, about Eliza's trembling hands, about the choice she was facing and the risks inherent in either decision. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer and began writing, not a letter, but notes. Contacts in Helena who might provide housing, lawyers he trusted who practiced territorial law, details about the Land Commission's reputation and their success rate with property investigations. Information Eliza might need if she decided to go, presented without pressure or expectation. When he finished, he read through his notes and realized what he'd actually created. Not information, a safety net, a way for her to take the risk without taking it alone. He folded the pages carefully and set them aside to give her in the morning. Outside, the March night was cold and clear, stars sharp as broken glass against the black sky. Somewhere in the valley, smoke rose from the hackberry cabin where a woman was making impossible choices with insufficient information and too much at stake. Nathaniel hoped she would choose to fight. But more than that, he hoped she would choose freely, with all the support and resources she needed to make the choice that was right for her rather than convenient for everyone else. It was the least he owed her. And possibly, though he wasn't quite ready to admit it yet, it was the most he could give. The morning came with frost on the windows and a sky the color of pewter, the kind of uncertain weather that promised either snow or sun by afternoon. Nathaniel found Eliza at the equipment shed before 7, already at work organizing the spring planning tools that would be needed in another few weeks. She looked up when he approached, her expression carefully neutral, the letter from Helena still visible in her apron pocket. "I brought you something," Nathaniel said, holding out the folded pages he'd written the night before. Eliza took them, unfolding the papers with cautious precision. Her eyes moved down the list. Contacts, lawyers, lodging options, details about the Land Commission's procedures, and something in her posture shifted. Not softening exactly, but acknowledging, recognition of what he was offering without demanding. "This is thorough," she said quietly. "I thought it might be useful, if you decide to go." "And if I don't? Then it's just paper." Nathaniel tucked his hands into his coat pockets against the cold. "I'm not trying to push you toward any particular decision, Eliza. I'm just trying to make sure you have what you need to decide freely." She looked at him directly then, and Nathaniel saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was measuring his sincerity, testing for manipulation or hidden expectation. He held her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever she needed to see. "Thank you," she said finally, refolding the papers. "I mean that. You don't have to decide today." "No, but I need to decide soon." She glanced toward the main house, then back at him. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Always." "Why does this matter to you? My case, my property. What happened in Bozeman? Why do you care?" It was the same question Jack had asked, the one Nathaniel had avoided answering because he hadn't fully understood the answer himself. But standing in the cold morning with Eliza watching him with those clear, measuring eyes, he found he couldn't dodge it anymore. "Because I built everything I have on the principle that competence and hard work should matter more than circumstance or connection," he said slowly. "And your situation is proof that principle is a lie. You did everything right. You worked hard, you were competent, you invested everything you had. And the system still destroyed you because you didn't have the right name or the right gender or the right lawyer. That's not justice. That's just cruelty dressed up as law. So this is about principle. It started that way." Nathaniel took a breath, choosing his next words carefully. "But somewhere between the equipment shed and Bozeman and watching you rebuild a life from absolutely nothing, it became about more than principle. It became about you specifically, about the fact that you deserve better than what you got. And maybe I'm in a position to help make that happen." Eliza's hands tightened on the papers. "That sounds dangerously close to charity, Mr. Cross." "It's not charity. Charity is giving something for nothing. This is recognition of debt. You don't owe me anything. Society owes you. The legal system owes you. Every man who looked at your situation and decided it was easier to believe you were grasping rather than grieving owes you." He met her eyes. "I can't fix all of that, but I can make sure you have resources and support if you decide to fight back. Not because you're helpless, but because fighting powerful systems alone is how people get destroyed." The silence that followed was different from their previous exchanges. Something had shifted in the space between them, some acknowledgement of territory being crossed and boundaries being redrawn. Eliza looked down at the papers in her hands, then back up at Nathaniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm going to Helena," she said. "Not because you want me to, but because I need to know if there's actually a chance of getting back what was stolen. Even if it's a small chance, I need to try." Relief flooded through Nathaniel's chest, though he kept his expression neutral. When do you leave? The hearing is in 2 weeks. I should probably go a few days early to meet with the lawyer they're providing, review the testimony, make sure I understand what they're asking for. I'll arrange the travel. You can take the train from Livingston. It's a straight shot to Helena, about 6 hours. The commission said they'd cover expenses. I know, but territorial reimbursement takes months and you'll need money for lodging and meals before then. Consider it an advance on your salary. Eliza started to protest, then stopped herself. You're very determined to help me. I'm very determined to see justice done. If that helps you in the process, so be it. She almost smiled at that, a brief quirk of her mouth that was there and gone before Nathaniel could be certain he'd seen it. All right, I accept, but I'm keeping records and I'm paying you back from my wages. Fair enough. Eliza tucked the papers into her apron alongside the commission's letter, then returned to her tool organization with the same focused attention she brought to everything. But Nathaniel noticed her shoulders had settled differently, some tension releasing that he hadn't realized she'd been carrying. He left her to her work and returned to the main house, feeling like he'd navigated a conversation successfully for the first time since this entire situation had started. He'd offered help without imposing it, provided resources without demanding gratitude, and somehow managed to support her choice without making it about his own need to fix things. Progress, even if it was incremental and fragile. That afternoon, Nathaniel rode into Livingston to make the travel arrangements himself. He booked Eliza a first-class ticket on the Montana Central, not because she needed luxury, but because the first-class cars were safer and more private for a woman traveling alone. He arranged a room at a respectable boarding house in Helena that he'd used before for business associates, a place run by a widow named Mrs. Kensington who would look after Eliza without asking intrusive questions. When he returned to the ranch that evening, he found a note waiting on his desk in Eliza's precise handwriting. It was brief, just 3 lines thanking him for the arrangements and confirming she would be ready to leave in 10 days. But at the bottom, below her signature, she'd added something else. I appreciate your faith in me, even when I don't entirely understand it. Nathaniel read those words 3 times, then folded the note and placed it in the desk drawer where he kept important documents. It felt significant somehow, this small acknowledgement that she recognized what he was trying to do, even if she remained wary of his motivations. He told himself it was professional satisfaction at having handled a difficult situation competently. He almost believed it. The next 10 days passed in a strange state of suspended tension. Eliza continued her work with the same methodical efficiency, but Nathaniel noticed she spent her evenings at the cabin preparing for the Helena trip, mending her best dress, reviewing the letter from the commission, writing what looked like pages of notes about dates and details she would need to remember for testimony. He didn't intrude on her preparation, but he made sure supplies appeared at the cabin when she needed them. Fresh paper, better lamp oil, a new pen when hers ran dry. She never asked for these things. He simply provided them, and she simply accepted them, and somehow that exchange felt more intimate than any conversation they'd had. Jack watched all of this with the knowing expression of someone who'd seen too much of human nature to be surprised by any of it. You're courting her, he said bluntly one evening as they reviewed the spring calving schedule. Nathaniel looked up sharply. I'm supporting an employee. You're bringing her supplies she doesn't ask for and arranging travel in first-class cars. That's courting. That's ensuring she has what she needs to succeed. Nate, I've known you for 8 years. I've watched you fire competent workers because they asked for accommodations you considered excessive. I've seen you refuse raises to men who'd worked for you for seasons because you didn't think they'd earned it yet. You're fair, but you're not generous. Jack leaned back in his chair. With her, you're generous. That means something. It means I recognize exceptional competence when I see it. It means you care about her specifically, not just her work product. And the sooner you're honest about that, the sooner you can figure out what you're actually doing. Nathaniel set down his pen with more force than necessary. What I'm doing is ensuring a capable woman gets the justice she deserves. Nothing more. And when she gets that justice, when the commission rules in her favor and she gets her land back, what then? The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of implication that Nathaniel hadn't allowed himself to consider. If Eliza's property was restored, she would leave. She would return to Bozeman, reclaim what was hers, and build the life she'd been trying to build before everything fell apart. She wouldn't need employment from him anymore. She wouldn't need the Hackberry cabin or the equipment shed or any of the careful infrastructure they'd built together over the past 3 months. She would be gone. And Nathaniel would be left with a perfectly organized tool inventory and an empty valley and the knowledge that he'd helped engineer his own loss. "Then she'll do whatever she chooses to do," Nathaniel said quietly, "and I'll respect that choice. Even if it means losing her. I don't have her to lose, Jack. She's an employee with a contract that ends in 2 weeks regardless of what happens in Helena. Keep telling yourself that." Jack stood, gathering the calving schedules. "But maybe consider what you actually want before you push her toward a future that doesn't include you." He left before Nathaniel could respond, and Nathaniel sat alone in his office with the uncomfortable realization that Jack was right. He'd been so focused on justice and principle and fixing what was broken that he hadn't calculated the logical endpoint of his own actions. If he succeeded in helping Eliza reclaim her property, he would lose the only person who genuinely challenged him in years. The thought bothered him more than it should have, far more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. On the morning Eliza was scheduled to leave for Helena, Nathaniel found her at the cabin before dawn, dressed in her traveling clothes with a small canvas bag packed beside the door. She wore the dress she'd been mending, a dark blue wool that had seen better years but was clean and carefully pressed. Her hair was pinned in a formal arrangement, and she'd added a small hat that looked handmade but dignified. She looked nervous and determined in equal measure. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked. "As I'll ever be." They rode to Livingston in the pre-dawn darkness, not speaking much, the silence between them comfortable but weighted with everything unsaid. The train station was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few early travelers and the station master preparing for the morning departure. Nathaniel helped Eliza with her bag, then handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Emergency funds, in case the commission reimbursement is delayed or you need something unexpected." "Nathaniel, it's a loan, not a gift. You'll pay it back from your wages, remember?" He kept his tone light. "And it's Mr. Cross in public, Mrs. Moore. Let's maintain some propriety." She almost smiled at that, tucking the envelope into her bag. "Thank you for all of this. Thank Mrs. Kensington when you arrive. She'll take good care of you. I meant thank you for believing this was worth pursuing, for giving me the choice instead of making it for me." Eliza looked at him directly. "I know I was angry when you went to Bozeman, but I understand what you were trying to do, even if the execution was problematic." "Problematic is generous. Perhaps. But your heart was in the right place, even if your methods needed work." The train whistle sounded in the distance, and they both turned to watch it approach. The moment stretched between them, full of things that couldn't be said in a public train station at dawn. "Come back," Nathaniel said finally. "Regardless of what happens in Helena, come back and tell me about it." "I will." "And Eliza?" He waited until she looked at him. "You're going to do well at this. You're one of the most capable people I've ever met, and they'd be fools not to see that." Something shifted in her expression, some wall cracking just slightly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in 2 years. Then people haven't been paying attention." The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a blast of steam. Nathaniel helped Eliza board, making sure she found her seat in the first-class car before stepping back onto the platform. She appeared in the window, raising one hand in farewell, and Nathaniel raised his in return. Then the train was moving, carrying her east toward Helena and whatever waited there, and Nathaniel stood on the platform watching until the last car disappeared around the bend. He rode back to the ranch in full daylight, the morning sun turning the snow-covered peaks gold and pink. The valley looked exactly as it always had, vast, productive, perfectly managed. But something felt different now, some absence that hadn't been there before. Jack was waiting when he returned, reading the morning's expression correctly without needing explanation. "She'll come back," Jack said. "Maybe." "She will. She's not done here yet." Nathaniel wanted to believe that. But he also knew that Eliza Moore was a woman who'd survived by making hard choices and following through on them regardless of personal cost. If Helena offered her the chance to reclaim her old life, she would take it, and he would have no right to ask her to do otherwise. He'd helped her get justice. Now he had to live with the consequences of that help, whatever they turned out to be. The week that followed Eliza's departure was the longest Nathaniel could remember in recent years. He threw himself into ranch work with single-minded intensity, spring branding, fence repair, contract negotiations with the Chicago beef buyers. He worked from before dawn until well after dark, pushing himself and his men harder than strictly necessary. Jack tolerated it for 3 days before cornering him in the barn. "You're driving everyone crazy," Jack said bluntly, "including yourself. We're behind schedule on the North Pasture. We're exactly on schedule. You're just trying to avoid thinking about Helena." Nathaniel continued examining the saddle he'd been inspecting for the past 10 minutes. "I'm not avoiding anything. You've checked that saddle 4 times. It's fine. You're avoiding." Jack pulled the saddle from Nathaniel's hands. "She's been gone less than a week. The hearing isn't until tomorrow. You won't hear anything until at least the day after." "I'm aware of the timeline." "Then stop acting like the world's ending and trust that she can handle this." "I do trust that." "No, you trust her competence, but you're terrified that if she succeeds, she won't need you anymore." Jack's expression softened slightly. "That's what's actually bothering you." Nathaniel leaned against the stall door, finally admitting what he'd been avoiding for days. "If the commission rules in her favor, she gets her property back. 40 acres and a cabin of her own. Why would she stay here doing equipment maintenance when she could be building her own life? Maybe because she's built something here too. Maybe because the life she's creating now is better than the life she lost. Or maybe she's been surviving here, and given the choice, she'll choose freedom over employment. Then that's her right." Jack's voice was firm. "But you don't get to decide for her, and you don't get to protect yourself from potential loss by assuming the worst. You wait. You trust, and when she comes back, you listen to what she actually wants instead of what you're afraid she wants." It was good advice. Nathaniel hated that it was good advice, but he took it anyway, forcing himself to return to normal routines, to trust that Eliza was capable of handling Helena and everything it represented. He stopped checking for telegrams every hour. He stopped calculating travel times and hearing schedules. He simply worked and waited and tried not to think about how empty the equipment shed felt without her presence. On the 8th day after Eliza's departure, a telegram arrived. Nathaniel read it 3 times, standing in the ranch office with Jack watching from the doorway. "Well?" Jack asked. "The commission ruled in her favor. They're reopening her case and investigating Marcus Haywood for professional misconduct. They've also ordered a review of all property transfers in Gallatin County for the past 5 years. "That's good news." "It is." Nathaniel looked up from the telegram. "She's coming back tomorrow, arriving on the afternoon train." "And?" "And I have absolutely no idea what happens next." Jack smiled slightly. "Then I guess you'll find out tomorrow." That night, Nathaniel sat at his desk with the ranch ledgers open in front of him, but instead of working on accounts, he found himself drafting something else entirely. A formal employment contract more comprehensive than the temporary agreement they'd signed in March. Permanent position, fair wages, housing in the Hackberry cabin with improvements to be made at ranch expense. Clear terms, defined responsibilities, everything spelled out with the precision he brought to all business arrangements. He wrote it, revised it, then set it aside and wrote something else. Not a contract, a letter. Explaining what the past 3 months had meant, what her presence had changed, what he hoped might be possible if she chose to stay not out of necessity, but out of genuine choice. He wrote 3 paragraphs before crumpling the paper and throwing it into the fire. Some things couldn't be put into words, at least not words on paper. Some things required standing in front of someone and being honest about uncertainty and risk, and the terrifying possibility that caring about someone meant giving them the power to leave. Nathaniel had built an empire on certainty and control. Now he was facing a situation where he had neither, and the only thing he could do was wait for Eliza to return and tell him what she'd decided. The next afternoon found him at the Livingston station 30 minutes early, pacing the platform like a man waiting for news from a battlefield. When the train finally arrived, he forced himself to stand still, to appear calm and professional, to give Eliza no indication of the chaos happening beneath his carefully maintained exterior. She stepped off the train looking tired but somehow lighter, the tension she'd been carrying for months visibly diminished. She saw him immediately and crossed the platform with purpose, her small bag in one hand and a leather document folder in the other. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Mrs. Moore. How was Helena?" "Productive." She held up the folder. The commission was thorough. They found irregularities in 17 cases similar to mine, all handled by Haywood or lawyers associated with him. They're launching a formal investigation, and they've assigned a territorial prosecutor to review my specific case. That's excellent news. It is, though it means this will take months to fully resolve, maybe longer. They stood on the platform, travelers streaming past them, and Nathaniel realized he was supposed to say something. Ask about her plans. Offer the contract. Do something other than stand here trying to read her expression for clues about decisions she hadn't announced yet. "I have the wagon," he said finally. "Unless you need to stay in town?" "No, I'd like to go back to the ranch, if that's acceptable." The phrasing was careful, non-committal. Back to the ranch, not home. Nathaniel nodded and took her bag, leading her to where he'd left the wagon. They rode in silence for the first few miles, the spring landscape rolling past. Snow mostly melted now, early grass showing green, the mountains still white-capped but less forbidding than they'd been in February. Finally, Eliza spoke. "The prosecutor asked me what I wanted," she said quietly. "If I wanted the property back, or financial compensation, or just official recognition that the transfer was fraudulent. He said I had options now that I didn't have before." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed time to think about it." Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins. "That's reasonable. The property is mine legally, or it should be once the review is complete. I could go back to Bozeman, reclaim the land, start over where I left off 2 years ago." She paused. "That's what I thought I wanted. It's what I've been working toward since Thomas died. But standing in that cabin now feels like stepping backward into someone else's life. The woman who lived there, who built that life with Thomas, who thought 40 acres and love were enough. She doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure I want to resurrect her." Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving Eliza the space to work through whatever she was trying to articulate. The wagon wheels creaked steadily against the dirt track, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called out, sharp and clear in the spring air. "What do you want to resurrect?" he asked finally. Eliza was silent for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the mountains rising ahead of them. "I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. For 2 years, I've been in survival mode. Every decision made out of necessity, every choice about avoiding the worst outcome rather than pursuing the best one. And now suddenly I have options, real options, and I don't know how to think about them." "Options like what?" "Like whether to take the property back and try to make it work as a single woman, knowing the same people who judged me before will judge me again. Like whether to accept financial compensation instead and use it to start completely fresh somewhere else. Like whether to—" She stopped, then seemed to gather her courage. "Like whether to stay here, if that's even a possibility." Nathaniel's chest tightened, but he kept his voice level. "It's a possibility. I drafted a formal employment contract while you were in Helena. Permanent position, fair wages, improvements to the cabin. It's in my office if you want to review it." "You drafted a contract." "I did. I thought it might be useful to have something concrete to consider." Eliza turned to look at him directly. "Is that what you want? For this to be a formal employment arrangement with contracts and terms and professional boundaries?" The question was a challenge, and they both knew it. Nathaniel could take the easy path, could hide behind contracts and professional distance, and pretend that the past 3 months had been nothing more than a successful business relationship. Or he could be honest about what had actually happened, even if that honesty risked everything. He pulled the wagon to a stop on the side of the road, set the brake, and turned to face Eliza fully. "No," he said quietly, "that's not what I want." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to stay, because you want to be here, not because you have nowhere else to go. I want to build something with you that isn't based on necessity or survival or contractual obligation. I want—" He stopped, searching for words that felt true rather than safe. "I want to see what's possible when two people who respect each other's competence and value each other's company decide to build a life together instead of just maintaining separate ones in proximity." Eliza's expression was unreadable. That sounds dangerously close to a partnership, Mr. Cross. It is a partnership. It's been a partnership since the day you fixed that first bridle and proved you weren't here to take advantage, just to survive with dignity. Nathaniel took a breath. I'm not good at this kind of honesty, Eliza. I built my entire life on control and certainty and measurable outcomes. But somewhere between the equipment shed and Helena, I started caring about your future in ways that have nothing to do with ranch efficiency and everything to do with not wanting to imagine this valley without you in it. The silence that followed felt enormous. A breeze moved through the pines, carrying the scent of new growth and snowmelt. Somewhere distant, cattle lowed. The world continued around them while they sat suspended in the moment between what had been and what might be. I'm afraid, Eliza said finally, I'm afraid that if I choose this, choose you, choose this place, I'll be making the same mistake I made before. Building my life around someone else's foundation instead of creating my own. Then don't build around my foundation. Build alongside it. Nathaniel chose his words carefully. The Hackberry cabin is yours regardless of what you decide about us. I'll deed you the land it sits on, separate from the ranch holdings. 20 acres free and clear, in your name only. You can build whatever you want there, a home, a business, complete independence. And if you decide you want partnership in addition to independence, that's a separate choice you can make freely. Eliza stared at him. You'd give me land. I'd transfer property that you've already improved and made valuable through your own labor. It should have been yours 3 months ago. I'm just making it official. That's not a small gesture, Nathaniel. It's not a gesture at all. It's recognition of reality. He met her eyes steadily. You asked me once why I cared about your case, about justice, about any of this. The truth is that you reminded me what I'd forgotten, that competence and character matter more than circumstance, and that building something worthwhile requires more than just individual effort. It requires recognizing when someone else's strength complements your own. And you think my strength complements yours. I know it does. You've made this operation more efficient, the men more capable, and forced me to examine assumptions I'd held for years about how things should be done. You've challenged me in ways I didn't know I needed. He paused. And somewhere in the process, you became essential in ways that have nothing to do with equipment maintenance or inventory systems. Eliza's eyes were bright, though whether from emotion or the spring wind, Nathaniel couldn't tell. Essential is a dangerous word. So is partnership. So is trust. So is any of this. Nathaniel reached across the space between them, offering his hand palm up. But I'm willing to risk dangerous if you are. She looked at his offered hand for a long moment, and Nathaniel felt the weight of everything balanced on this choice. If she took his hand, they would be stepping into territory neither of them had mapped, building something that required vulnerability and honesty and all the things he'd spent his adult life avoiding. If she didn't, he would keep his word about the land and the employment and would somehow find a way to work alongside her while pretending his heart wasn't involved. Eliza placed her hand in his. Her grip was firm, calloused from months of hard work, warm despite the spring chill. Nathaniel closed his fingers around hers and felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like the first crack in river ice at the beginning of thaw. I'm terrified, she said quietly, but I'm also tired of making choices out of fear instead of hope. Then choose hope. Choose possibility. Choose to build something new instead of trying to resurrect something that's gone. With you. With me. If you want that. Eliza squeezed his hand once, firmly, then released it. I want to see the contract first, and I want the land transfer in writing before we discuss anything else, because partnership requires equal foundation, and I won't build anything on top of charity or goodwill. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Nathaniel felt himself smile. You're negotiating. I'm establishing terms. There's a difference. Fair enough. He released the brake and urged the horses forward again. When we get back to the ranch, we'll review both documents. You can propose amendments, I'll counter, and we'll reach an agreement that satisfies both parties. And after that? After that, we figure out what partnership actually looks like when it's not just theory. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in comfortable silence, but something had changed between them. The careful professional distance had dissolved, replaced by something more honest and infinitely more complicated. Nathaniel found himself acutely aware of Eliza beside him, the way she watched the landscape with proprietary interest now, rather than wary assessment, the slight relaxation in her shoulders, the fact that she didn't flinch away when his arm brushed hers as the wagon hit a rut. When they arrived at the ranch, Jack was waiting by the barn with the kind of studied casualness that meant he'd been watching for them. He took in their expressions, the way they moved around each other with new ease, and allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. "Helena went well, I take it," he said to Eliza. "Very well. The commission was thorough and fair. And you're back." "I am." Jack glanced at Nathaniel. "For how long?" "Permanently," Nathaniel said before Eliza could answer, "assuming we can agree on terms." Jack's weathered face broke into something that might have been a smile. "About damn time. Both of you were driving me crazy with the dancing around." "We weren't dancing," Nathaniel protested. "You were absolutely dancing. Worse than watching a barn dance with all the young fools too nervous to actually ask their partners onto the floor." Jack took the horse's leads. "Go negotiate your terms. I'll handle the wagon." Nathaniel and Eliza walked to the main house together, and Nathaniel found himself noticing details he usually overlooked. The way the afternoon light hit the porch steps, the sound of Eliza's boots on the wooden planks, the fact that she entered the house without hesitation now, instead of waiting for explicit invitation. He retrieved the contract and the land transfer documents from his desk, spreading them on the kitchen table where they'd signed her original employment agreement 3 months ago. Eliza pulled out a chair and sat, reading through each page with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. Nathaniel poured coffee and waited, watching her read. She made small notations in the margins occasionally, her expression thoughtful but not troubled. When she finished, she set down the pen and looked at him. "The contract is generous," she said, "more than fair in terms of wages and responsibilities. But it includes a clause that terminates my employment if I marry." Nathaniel felt heat rise in his face. "That's standard language. Most employment contracts include it." "I'm aware. I'm asking if you intend to enforce it." He stopped, realizing the trap he'd walked into. "No, I don't intend to enforce it. In fact, I'd like to remove that clause entirely." "Why?" "Because it's outdated and assumes that marriage makes women incapable of employment, which is absurd, and because—" He met her eyes. "Because I don't want legal language that forces you to choose between partnership with me and employment that gives you independence." Eliza's expression softened. "Then cross it out." Nathaniel drew a line through the entire clause, initialing the change. "Done. What else?" "The land transfer is clean, 20 acres including the cabin and the creek access, deeded in my name with no encumbrances or liens. It's more than I expected. It's what you've earned. No one earns 20 acres by repairing tack and organizing tools. You earned it by taking an abandoned structure and making it functional, by improving my operation without being asked, by proving that competence matters more than circumstance." Nathaniel leaned forward, "and by being honest enough to tell me when I was wrong, which is worth more than any amount of fence repair." Eliza traced the edge of the document with one finger. "If I sign this, I'll own property again, real property in my name that no one can take from me. That's the idea. And if I sign the employment contract, I'll have income and purpose beyond just survival." "Yes. And if I accept what you're offering beyond the contracts, the partnership, the possibility of something more, I'll have a future I didn't think existed anymore." "All of that is true." Nathaniel kept his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "But you don't have to decide everything right now. Sign what you're comfortable with, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." Eliza picked up the pen, signed the land transfer with clear, decisive strokes, then did the same with the employment contract. She dated both documents, pushed them across the table to Nathaniel, and stood. "I need to see the cabin," she said. "My cabin now. I need to see it and understand what it means to own something again." "Do you want company?" She considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, but not to help or fix or manage, just to be there." They walked to the Hackberry Valley together in the late afternoon light, following the trail that Nathaniel had ridden that first morning in February when he'd discovered smoke rising from a structure he'd written off as lost. The valley looked different now, the creek running full and clear, the pines showing new growth, the meadow grass beginning to green. And the cabin itself had transformed from ruin to dwelling, the repairs Eliza had made holding strong through the winter. Eliza stood in front of the cabin for a long time, just looking at it. Nathaniel stayed beside her, not touching, but present, understanding that this moment required space and witnessed both. "It's mine," she said finally, her voice carrying wonder. "Actually mine. Not by marriage or inheritance or someone else's charity. Mine because I built it." "You did." "When I first came here, I thought I was just surviving, finding shelter until I could move on to something better." She turned to look at Nathaniel. "I didn't expect better to be here. I didn't expect to build something worth keeping. And now? Now I want to build more. I want to expand the cabin, add a proper root cellar, plant that garden I cleared. I want to make this place into something permanent instead of temporary." "That sounds like a plan." "It sounds like hope," Eliza corrected, "which is different from a plan and infinitely more terrifying." Nathaniel moved closer, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel his presence. "What are you hoping for?" "That I can build a life on my own foundation this time. That partnership doesn't mean losing myself again." She looked at him directly. "That I can trust you to mean what you say about wanting equals instead of rescuing someone you feel sorry for." "I don't feel sorry for you. I feel awed by you." Nathaniel said it simply, letting the truth stand without embellishment. "You survived things that would have destroyed most people, and you did it without losing your competence or your dignity. That's not something to pity. That's something to respect." Eliza's eyes were bright now, definitely with emotion rather than wind. "I've spent 2 years believing I was fundamentally broken, that losing Thomas and the land meant I'd failed at building a life." "You didn't fail. The system failed you." "Maybe. But standing here now, looking at what I've built even when I thought I was just surviving, maybe failure and loss aren't the same thing. Maybe I lost something precious, but that doesn't mean I'm broken." "You're not broken. You're resilient. There's a significant difference." Eliza turned to face him fully, and Nathaniel saw the decision forming in her expression before she spoke. "I'm staying. Not just with the employment contract, but with everything. I'm choosing this valley, this cabin, and the possibility of partnership with you." Relief and something more complicated flooded through Nathaniel's chest. "You're sure?" "No. I'm terrified and uncertain, and I have no idea if this will work." She took a step closer. "But I'm sure that I want to try, that I'm tired of making choices out of fear, and I'd rather risk failure with someone who respects my strength than play it safe alone." Nathaniel reached for her hand, the same gesture he'd offered in the wagon, but this time she met him halfway. Their fingers interlaced, and he felt the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip, the steadiness that had drawn him to her from that first morning. "I need you to understand something," he said carefully. "I'm not good at vulnerability. I built my entire life on control and self-sufficiency, and letting someone matter this much goes against every instinct I've developed. I know, you're possibly the most determinedly independent person I've ever met. But I'm willing to learn, to try, to figure out what partnership looks like when both people are too stubborn to need rescuing but choose connection anyway." Eliza's expression softened into something that looked like the beginning of a smile. "That sounds like the most complicated, difficult, worthwhile thing either of us has ever attempted." "Probably. Good. I don't trust easy things anymore." Nathaniel pulled her closer, and she came willingly, resting her forehead against his shoulder in a gesture of exhausted relief. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the solid reality of her presence, the way she fit against him like something essential he hadn't known was missing. They stood like that for a long time, the spring wind moving through the valley, the creek murmuring nearby, the cabin standing solid behind them. No words, no promises beyond what had already been said. Just presence and possibility and the first fragile foundation of something being built deliberately instead of desperately. Finally, Eliza pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "I have conditions." "Of course you do." "I want the cabin expansion designed together. Equal input, equal decision-making." "Agreed. I want to maintain my position managing the equipment and training the younger hands. Not as your employee primarily, but as an independent contractor who happens to work closely with your operation. That's actually more efficient, agreed. And I want time. Time to figure out what partnership means without rushing into anything we're not ready for. Nathaniel nodded slowly. That's fair, though I reserve the right to eventually ask for more than just partnership. More like what? Like marriage. Like building a life together that's legally and personally bound, not just professionally aligned. He kept his voice steady. But only when we're both certain it's what we want, not what circumstances have forced us into. Eliza studied his face, searching for something. You'd marry me knowing I come with legal battles and a complicated past and absolutely no social standing? I'd marry you because you're the most competent, honest, resilient person I've ever met. The rest is just details. Those are significant details, Nathaniel. So is the fact that you make me want to be better than I am. That's worth more than social standing. She reached up, touching his face gently, and Nathaniel felt something in his chest crack wide open. Not breaking, but opening, making space for something he'd never allowed himself to want before. Ask me again in 6 months, Eliza said softly. When we've had time to build this partnership properly. When we're both certain it's built on solid ground instead of necessity or rescue or anything else that won't last. 6 months. Maybe a year. I can wait a year, Nathaniel said. I can wait however long it takes for you to be certain. Good. Eliza kissed him then, brief and sweet, a promise of possibility rather than completion. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. Now help me figure out where the expansion should go. I'm thinking we could add a proper workshop space along the north wall. The shift from emotional intimacy to practical planning was so perfectly Eliza that Nathaniel had to smile. A workshop for what? For teaching. I want to train more of the younger hands in basic maintenance and repair. Maybe even offer classes to other ranches' workers for a fee. Turn competence into actual business instead of just employment. That's ambitious. That's partnership. I bring skills, you provide space and connections. We both benefit from the results. They spent the next hour walking the property line, discussing expansion possibilities, planning the garden layout, calculating costs and timelines. It was practical and businesslike and somehow more intimate than any romantic declaration could have been. They were building something together, not out of desperation or necessity, but out of deliberate choice and mutual respect. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink, they walked back toward the main ranch together. Halfway there, Nathaniel noticed smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney and remembered something important. The men are going to want to celebrate, he said. Jack will have told them you're staying by now. Is that a problem? No, but they'll expect some kind of announcement or explanation. Eliza considered this. Tell them the truth, that I'm staying as an independent contractor with my own property, working in partnership with the ranch, and that anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with you. That's going to start rumors. Let them. Rumors are better than secrets, and secrets are how women end up with no legal standing when things go wrong. Nathaniel appreciated the practical cynicism in that statement. Fair point. We'll make a formal announcement at dinner. The announcement, when it came, was met with a mixture of approval and knowing looks from the ranch hands. Several of the younger men who'd been learning from Eliza looked genuinely pleased. A few of the older hands exchanged significant glances that suggested they'd been taking bets on the outcome. Jack just nodded once, satisfied, and went back to his meal. After dinner, as Eliza prepared to return to her cabin, Nathaniel walked her to where she'd left her coat. Tomorrow, we start the expansion planning properly, he said. I'll bring the surveying equipment down in the morning. And the legal documents? The land transfer needs to be filed officially. I'll ride to town on Friday and handle it personally. Eliza pulled on her coat, then paused. Thank you for all of this, for seeing me clearly instead of just seeing someone who needed rescue. Thank you for staying, for choosing this even when you had other options. I chose the best option. That's just good strategy. She left before he could respond, walking out into the spring darkness with a confidence that hadn't been there 3 months ago. Nathaniel watched from the porch until her lamp appeared in the cabin window, a small, steady light in the valley below. Jack appeared beside him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Nathaniel without comment. "You did good," Jack said finally. "We'll see. We haven't actually built anything yet beyond a few contracts and a lot of complicated feelings. You built trust. That's harder than buildings." Jack sipped his coffee. "She's good for you. Makes you less rigid, more honest. She terrifies me." "Good. You need someone who terrifies you, keeps you from getting complacent." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the cabin light. After a while, Jack said, "You're really going to deed her that land? Already signed the documents, filing them Friday. That's a significant commitment. It's overdue justice, and it's the foundation she needs to choose this freely instead of out of necessity." Jack nodded slowly. "Your father would have thought you were crazy." "My father thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong, including that success requires total control and emotional distance." "And what do you think?" Nathaniel considered the question, watching the light in Eliza's window. "I think success requires partnership with people who make you better. I think control is less important than trust, and I think emotional distance is just another word for loneliness." "That's almost poetic, Nate." "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain." Jack laughed, finished his coffee, and headed toward his own quarters. Nathaniel stayed on the porch a while longer, watching the valley settle into darkness, the cabin light steady below. He'd spent years building an empire on certainty and measurable outcomes. Now he was stepping into territory that was uncertain, unmeasurable, and infinitely more valuable than anything he'd built before. It was terrifying. It was exactly right. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Cross felt like he was building something that actually mattered, not just to his ledgers or his reputation, but to the shape of his life and the possibility of his future. The next 6 months unfolded with the steady rhythm of building something permanent. Nathaniel filed the land transfer documents in Livingston, paying for expedited processing and making sure every detail was legally sound. When the deed came back with Eliza's name inscribed as sole owner, he presented it to her over breakfast at the main house, and she'd held the document with shaking hands before carefully filing it in the small safe she'd purchased for the cabin. They expanded the cabin together, working alongside hired carpenters to add the workshop space Eliza had envisioned. She taught maintenance classes to ranch hands from 3 neighboring properties, charging fair rates and building a reputation that extended well beyond Nathaniel's operation. The income went into her own account, separate from her ranch salary, creating the financial independence she needed to know she was choosing partnership rather than accepting dependency. The legal battle in Helena progressed slowly but favorably. Marcus Haywood's law license was suspended pending investigation, and the territorial prosecutor building the case against the fraudulent property transfers contacted Eliza monthly with updates. Her original 40 acres remained in legal limbo, but the commission had offered substantial financial compensation that would be finalized within the year. Nathaniel and Eliza settled into a partnership that was part professional collaboration, part personal connection, and entirely built on mutual respect. They had dinner together 3 times a week, worked side by side on ranch projects, and maintained separate living spaces that allowed for independence even as they grew closer. It was methodical, careful, and exactly what they both needed. And on a cold November evening, exactly 8 months after Eliza had returned from Helena, Nathaniel walked down to the cabin with a question he'd been preparing for weeks. He found her in the workshop, teaching 2 young ranch hands the proper technique for conditioning leather. She looked up when he entered, smiled briefly, then finished her demonstration before sending the young men back to the bunkhouse. "You're here late," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Something serious, judging by your expression." Nathaniel pulled a small box from his coat pocket and set it on the workbench between them. "You told me to ask again in 6 months. It's been 8. Eliza stared at the box, then at him. "Nathaniel, I know we said a year. I know we're still building this foundation. But I also know that I'm certain now in ways I wasn't 8 months ago." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small Montana sapphire. "I'm not asking you to be rescued or to build your life around mine. I'm asking you to marry me because partnership with you is the best decision I've ever made, and I want to make it permanent." Eliza picked up the ring, examining it in the lamplight. "This is beautiful." It's practical. Gold is durable. Sapphire is hard to damage. But it's perfect, she interrupted. It's exactly what I would have chosen for myself. Is that a yes? It's a yes with conditions. She set the ring down carefully. I keep my property separate. My business remains independent, and we draft a legal agreement that protects both of us if anything goes wrong. You want a marriage contract? I want clarity and fairness. I won't enter into this with less protection than I have now. Nathaniel felt himself smile. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. I'm serious. So am I. And I agree to all your conditions. He picked up the ring, holding it ready. So is that a yes? Eliza extended her left hand, and Nathaniel slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, because he'd measured using one of her work gloves and had its size specifically. She looked at it for a long moment, then up at him with eyes that were bright with emotion. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. And I'll trust that what we're creating is strong enough to last. Nathaniel pulled her close, and she came into his arms with the same steady confidence she brought to everything. They stood in the workshop surrounded by tools and leather and the evidence of her competence, and Nathaniel felt a certainty he'd never experienced before. Not the cold certainty of control and measurable outcomes, but the warm certainty of choosing someone and being chosen in return. They were married in January in a quiet ceremony at the main house, with Jack as witness and a territorial judge performing the service. Eliza wore a new dress she'd made herself, deep blue wool with practical lines. Nathaniel wore his best suit and tried not to think about how terrifying it was to stand in front of a judge and promise permanence. But when Eliza took his hand and spoke her vows with the same clear honesty she brought to everything, the fear dissolved. They weren't making promises based on romance or desperation. They were making practical commitments based on proven partnership, and that was infinitely more solid than any declaration made in passion. The legal documents were signed alongside the marriage certificate. Property agreements, business arrangements, clear terms for a partnership built on equality rather than assumption. It was unromantic and absolutely necessary, and Nathaniel loved Eliza more for insisting on it. After the ceremony, they had a quiet dinner with Jack and a few of the senior ranch hands who'd become friends rather than just employees. There were toasts and congratulations and knowing looks, but mostly there was the comfortable warmth of people who'd watched something difficult become something worthwhile. That night, Eliza moved her essential belongings to the main house, though she kept the cabin as her workshop and teaching space. They'd discussed living arrangements extensively, deciding that shared space in the main house with the cabin remaining as Eliza's independent territory was the best balance of partnership and autonomy. As they settled into bed in what was now their shared room, Eliza turned to Nathaniel with a thoughtful expression. I got a letter from the territorial prosecutor yesterday, she said. I didn't want to mention it before the ceremony in case it complicated things. Nathaniel felt tension spike in his chest. What did it say? The commission is finalizing the property review. They're offering me 3 options. Take back the original 40 acres with all improvements made by the current occupant, accept financial compensation equivalent to current market value, or accept alternative property of equal value elsewhere in the territory. What do you want to do? Eliza was quiet for a moment. The compensation makes the most sense financially. That land represents my past, but I don't need to physically reclaim it to prove it was stolen. The money would let me expand my workshop, maybe purchase equipment for more advanced training. That sounds like you've decided. I think I have. Is that wrong? Should I want the actual land back? Nathaniel pulled her closer. You should want whatever serves your future best. The past deserves acknowledgement, but it doesn't require resurrection. That's what I keep telling myself. She rested her head on his shoulder. I spent 2 years thinking I needed that specific piece of land to prove I hadn't failed. But standing here now, in this house, with this partnership, I realize I've built something better than what I lost. You've built it yourself, that's the difference. We've built it, Eliza corrected. That's what partnership means. They lay in comfortable silence, and Nathaniel felt the weight of the day settling into satisfaction. They'd taken a risk on each other, built trust through action rather than assumption, and created something that was stronger for being deliberately chosen rather than desperately needed. Outside, the January wind howled across the valley, but inside the house was warm and solid. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but no longer frightening, full of possibilities they would navigate together. It wasn't the ending Nathaniel had imagined when he'd ridden down to the Hackberry Valley that February morning and found smoke rising from a cabin he'd written off as lost. It was better. It was real. It was built on honesty and competence and the hard-won understanding that the strongest foundations come from choosing partnership freely rather than accepting rescue desperately. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Cross understood that control was less valuable than connection, that certainty was less important than trust, and that building something worthwhile required the courage to be vulnerable with someone who'd earned the right to see him clearly. Eliza had earned that right, and he'd chosen to give it freely. That was the real victory, not justice restored or property reclaimed, but two people who'd survived loss and built themselves back stronger, deciding that survival wasn't enough. Choosing instead to build something permanent, something shared, something that mattered more than any individual achievement ever could. The story ended not with rescue or redemption, but with choice. Two capable people standing on solid ground they'd built together, looking toward a future they would shape deliberately and navigate as equals. It was everything neither of them had known they needed. And it was exactly right.